I wish we had this already. Not very difficult. Transparency, information, for which consumers can make decisions, investors can make decisions, and you would think in the 21st century that's not a problem. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs be discharged from further consideration, and that the Senate now proceed to H.R. 5084. I further ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, the purpose of the Securities Exchange Commission is to protect investors and to maintain orderly, efficient markets. This bill would change that deal. It would change the entire premise of the SEC. It would use the SEC to pressure people to disclose personal information that has no connection to the financial health of the company, information that many people, understandably, justifiably, and with really good reason, prefer to keep private. Why? Well, it's because it's not the public's business, it's theirs. The bill requires businesses to probe the race, gender, ethnicity, and veteran status of not only those already on the senior payroll of their companies, but also anyone who is even considered for those positions. Second, the free market already provides a way to achieve these goals. If investors prefer to invest in companies that have certain kinds of people on their boards and certain kinds of people in executive positions, then companies have a financial incentive to disclose that information. No one's stopping them from doing that. And many companies do, in fact, disclose that information. Many companies are already providing this information because their customers and their investors are demanding it. Government is neither omniscient nor omnipotent. It's not a deity. It's just force. It's just organized, collective, official force. That's all it is. We should not use the heavy hand of government for things that the American people already have the opportunity to do on their own, and in many, if not most cases, already are doing on their own. Finally, the bill co-opts federal employees at the SEC to create a diversity advisory group of government bureaucrats and academics who will advise Congress on policies to increase ethnic and gender diversity on corporate boards. Now, we already have a diversity advisory group. We already have this. It's the millions of Americans who we represent. To think that bureaucrats at the SEC could inform Congress of the importance of inclusion and diversity better than the American people is wasteful. And to think that it's appropriate to vest in the SEC, an entity designed to protect investors from fraudulent activities of those running these enterprises, is just the wrong conception, not only of the SEC, but of government in general. For these reasons, Mr. President, I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Well, I'm not surprised, but I'm deeply disappointed that my colleague takes that position. First of all, the SEC has a diversity rule. 2009, it has a diversity rule. But the diversity rule, as they devised it, doesn't do anything about transparency of information. So we're not creating something at the SEC that the SEC itself wasn't pursuing in the protection of investors. If I was an investor, I'd like to know whether a company is diverse or not. Latinos represent 20% of the entire country, the fastest growing, largest minority in the nation. I'd like to know if the money I'm going to put into a stock, buying the stock of a company, does it reflect the understanding of that community in any way? African Americans, does it reflect that understanding? Does it reflect the understanding that 50% of the population are women? And the free market, yes, the free market works on information. You make decisions in the free market based on information, but when the information is hidden from you, when you can't find out, in fact, what is the diversity of a corporate board, senior executive management, procurement, and other things, well then, the free market doesn't work very well, does it? And the heavy hand of government, oh my God, to disclose, to be transparent, that is the heavy hand of government. Well, if government doesn't work to make our systems more transparent so that investors and consumers can make decisions, who will do that? The free market? I don't think so. The gentleman I know has been very much in advocacy of transparency in other matters. Somehow in this one it seems to be a problem. And protect investors, yeah, I want to protect investors because I think investors who would be making investments in a company that are devoid of African Americans, devoid of Latinos, devoid of the representation of who America is today, they may think twice about them. Large pension funds, other entities may say, wait a minute, that's not the type of company I want to invest in. But the investor won't know that unless they have that information. So I would think that in the 21st century, when we see the national debate that is taking place today on the questions of race, on the questions of ethnicity and other things, that we would want at least to have the data so that we can make intelligent decisions. And by the way, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce came, now the Chamber of Commerce is normally not on my side. They came and testified specifically in support of this provision. They represent business in America. And they came forth and said, we believe that, in fact, this is good for business. If it wasn't good for business, they wouldn't be there. They wouldn't be advocating for it. So we will succeed at this. We may not have done it today by this process, but we will succeed at this because the nation requires it. It's good accountability. It's good transparency. It's good for the free market to know what the information is so people can make decisions. And it's certainly, at the end of the day, about protecting investors. So I look forward to making that happen at the appropriate time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I have deep affection and admiration for my friend and colleague, the senator from New Jersey. I do respectfully but strongly disagree with his position on this. He made the point several times that if he were acting as an investor, he'd very much like to know the composition of a corporate board or of an executive team within a corporation. And this is great. A lot of people feel the same way. That isn't the question. No one's stopping a corporation from disclosing that information. In fact, a whole lot of corporations do. Some may not want to do that. Some might want to disclose some of this information, but not all of it. Some might not want to be in the position of asking probing questions regarding the gender and ethnicity and race of their employees, understanding that it will then be disclosed to the public under the crushing force of federal law. There are legitimate reasons why a company might not want to do that, some of which have to do with that company's own ability to treat its employees and its board members and its executive team with dignity and respect. In some circumstances, not everything is the government's business. Transparency, yes, absolutely something that I believe in. Transparency usually refers to what we need when it comes to government action. Transparency is what we demand when we require open public hearings, when government does business. Transparency is what we require when we allow government documents to be made public and allow the public to see into what the regulatory process is doing. Transparency doesn't mean that everything that everyone does in America that has a tie to economic activity is the public's business. The fact that it's publicly traded doesn't mean that it's owned by the government. So the statement made by my colleague to the effect that when information is hidden from you, then the free market doesn't work very well. I don't understand what that means. If what he's suggesting is that it's hidden from them in violation of law, that's not the case. If what he's suggesting is that the free market can't punish those who refuse to disclose information about their boards and reward those who do, that is exactly what the free market does. The free market has every opportunity to work here. It's not as though nobody is providing this information, but it's not their business. As to the suggestion that because the Chamber of Commerce supports this, therefore it's pro-business, and because it's pro-business, we should all support it, I respectfully but strongly disagree. I know that as a Republican, I'm supposed to automatically agree with what the Chamber of Commerce says. Sometimes I do, but you know, Mr. President, a whole lot of the time I don't. This goes back a long time, back to the time when the U.S. Chamber of Commerce opposed a massive tax reform bill that was proposed by President Calvin Coolidge. I found some relief in the fantastic eponymous book Coolidge, about President Coolidge and his proposal of that reform. A reform that, by the way, helped build America's middle class and resulted in explosive economic growth. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce opposed that reform. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce gets a lot of things wrong, and it's wrong here. This isn't the government's business. These businesses are not government. They can do what they want, and it's not our place to say otherwise. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I appreciate the intellectual exercise we're going through on the floor. I'll just make two final comments because I know that my colleague is anxiously waiting to talk about the need for people to be able to put food on the table. Look, the Securities and Exchange Commission exists, yes, to protect investors and to also have the marketplace, but they make all types of demands upon the companies that are publicly traded in terms of disclosure of information. So I don't know what's so difficult about that. I will say this, the nation will have a rude awakening if it thinks it can continue with business as usual. A rude awakening. Something as simple as simply knowing what is the information about diversity on corporate boards that every study shows actually improves the bottom line and that investors should be able to have to make those decisions. And we're not talking about the employees, we're talking about the corporate board members. My God, the people who make billions of dollars of decisions, who ultimately decide where they go to a community or don't go to a community to invest in, who ultimately get the dollars from the communities that I'd like to see represented there. It's good enough to take our money, but it's not good enough to have us have any representation. And evidently in this body, it's not even good enough to have the information. So I know who's taking my money without representation. That cannot be the American way. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, the fact that, as my distinguished friend and colleague from New Jersey says, the fact that they make all types of demands on publicly traded companies is not a substitute for an actual logical or legal argument as to why they're entitled to information that is not theirs. Information that these companies may or may not choose to collect because that's their business. It's not the government's business, and it sure as heck isn't the government. So the fact that they make all types of demands on publicly traded companies doesn't prove the point here. We have to remember something. And yes, we have to remember it right now in this moment, not in spite of this moment, but because of it. Government is force. We've seen the catastrophic consequences of people who lose sight of what government is for, what its limitations are. And the fact that we don't have access to angels, as James Madison described it in Federalist 51. If men were angels, we wouldn't have a need of government. If we had access to angels to run our government, we wouldn't need all these rules. But because we are not angels, we don't have access to them to run our government. We have to have rules, and there have to be limitations on what is and isn't the role of government. Now, look, there are all kinds of businesses that keep track of this information, of their corporate board members and those considered for those positions, their executives and those considered for those positions. It's not our role to tell them about the information they have to extract from each and every person they interview for those positions and demand that they be publicly disclosed. Why? Well, because among other things, it's none of their darn business, and in many cases, it's none of ours. That's the business of the individual. We shouldn't be punishing companies businesses, hardworking Americans. And yes, some of them are rich, a whole lot of them are not rich. We shouldn't be punishing them just because they don't happen to share our view of how they ought to be operating their government. I find it curious that he says over and over again that this is how they will be more successful, this is how they will make more money. Well, that's not our place to decide. They're free to operate their business in a foolish way, in a way that might cost them money. It doesn't make it our place to decide this. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Michigan.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today and will be joined by